On November 17th of 1978, 4 employees were finishing up their shifts at a fast food restaurant. These innocent workers were taken hostage and then brought to a field where something terrible would take place. It's been 46 years since this happened, and not one person has been arrested. This is the case of the Burger Chef murders. Hello, friend, and welcome to High Time Crime. My name's Joel, and on here I specialize in true crime and also dabbing into philosophy. Now you can become whatever it is that you truly want to be. The first step and the key to success is this one very thing. Think about it and never let it go. But anyway, today we're going over the Burger Chef murders that happened quite some time ago. You're going to learn about a lot of weird things, so buckle up. On Friday, November 17th of 1978, 4 employees were working at a Burger Chef in Speedway, Indiana. According to Wikipedia, Burger Chef was an American fast food restaurant chain. It began operating in 1954 in Indianapolis, expanded throughout the United States, and at its peak in 1973, it had 1,050 locations, including some in Canada. In 1982, the owner of Burger Chef decided to sell the restaurant chain, the name and trademark, to Hardee's, and by 1996, the last Burger Chef restaurant closed. I do wonder what they tasted like, but here's a Burger Chef commercial to give you an idea of what it was like.
It's Burger Chef and Jeff.
Rooting burgers, no one's happy here. Even the dogs frown.
Not for long, Jeff. My new Fun Burger's going to put a smile on every face.
Puzzling pickles, what's a fun burger?
Well, it's a delicious burger with a smile on the wrapper and a prize inside, like this flying top.
Or maybe a dune buggy.
Yes, or perhaps a bubble pipe. The Fun Burger with a surprise prize, only at Burger Chef.
Incrediburgable!
But anyway, back to the Burger Chef located on 5725 Crawfordsville Road. Once again, there were 4 employees inside. You had 20-year-old Jane Freet, the assistant manager. The cook on grill was named Mark Flemons, and he was 16 years old. Another boy, a 16-year-old named Daniel Davis, was there, and Ruth Shelton was 17 years old, and she was also there. I'm going to give you a little background about all of them to give you a better understanding of who they were. First off, Jane Carol Freet was born on May 2nd of 1958 to her parents George and Carolyn Freet. Jane had 1 sister and 3 brothers. One of those brothers will be talked about here soon, so remember that. But Jane was a kind girl who worked as an assistant manager at Burger Chef. She had worked there for quite some time, until about 3 months prior to November of '78, when she was promoted to assistant manager at the Crawfordsville Road location. Before this, Jane was being moved around to other Burger Chefs and filling in for managers and other people. It was said that Jane was a Girl Scout leader when she was younger, and a very gutsy girl. Jane supposedly had a boyfriend for about 2 years or so, and for the past few months before that day, she was seeing this guy on and off. He would typically go to her apartment. Jane lived alone, however. Jane was said to have dabbled into some of the good green. She didn't drink much, and it was said she was firmly against. Once again, I'm going to get further into this in a bit, so just remember this point. But apparently about 2 weeks prior, Jane had fired an employee who did something involving, I'm not sure what, but apparently he could have blamed her for firing him. There was also another employee that was supposed to work from 10 p.m. to closing time on that Friday, but he didn't show. He had been in trouble for something earlier in the week and was fired, but nobody told him. Jane could have possibly fired him, but I'll talk more about that here shortly. Jane, for the last week, had been receiving weird telephone calls. In one, she was asked what she was wearing, but she didn't really take these calls seriously. Now, Jane, in the weeks leading up to that Friday, had two interesting conversations with two different people. The first one being with, I believe, her boyfriend. Though it's redacted, it also could have been someone else, but this person had said they had gotten robbed several times and that they talked to Jane about it. Jane had said that if she ever got robbed, that she would give up the money right away. Jane also had a conversation with her coworker, Mark Flemons, and they were eerily talking about the Sirloin Stockade murders committed by a guy named Roger Dale Stafford. Basically, 6 employees of a Sirloin Stockade restaurant were murdered in cold blood. While Jane and Mark were talking about this, Mark told her, "Don't worry, that he'll protect her because he's been taking karate." Now, the next person I'll talk about is Mark Sylvester Flemons, who was born on December 31st of 1961. Mark was about 6 foot tall, 158 pounds, and considered to be a cool guy. Mark's father said that he wasn't a very good student in school and was on probation for shoplifting. Also, not long before this, Mark got into a fight at his high school because someone stole his hair pick from his back pocket. It was said that Mark and Jane were good friends, and in fact, that they were on a path to possibly getting into a relationship. But something interesting here is that 2 months before, November 17th, Mark's father made him quit his job at Burger Chef because of a girl who was working there. Mark and this girl were having some sort of relationship, and Mark's father thought it would lead to nothing, and he told Mark to break it off. Mark told his father that this girl didn't want to break up, and so Mark's father made him quit. Once this girl kind of faded out of the picture and quit Burger Chef, Mark started working again only 3 days before. On Friday, November 17th of 1978, Mark and his sister India, who also worked at Burger Chef, left for their shifts at about 4:10 p.m. They lived close enough to the restaurant to where they could walk, and so they did just that. Mark and India got there at about 4:15 to 4:20-ish or so, and Mark was set to work from 4:30 p.m. to close, or about 12 to 2 a.m. India was working from 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. To add to this, though, I don't think Mark was supposed to be working that night, and he took a shift from a girl named Ginger. Mark apparently tried to get out of this at the last minute, but the manager made him have to follow through with it. I believe that could have been Jane. At 8 p.m., India got off and Mark took a break from work. They then went across the street to a place called Galaxy Disco for teenagers. It's interesting though, because while Mark was 16, his sister was either 21 or 22, so not really a teenager. But it cost about $2 to enter, and the brother and sister didn't have any money. Eventually, 2 boys and 2 girls, who were Mark and India's friends, came out of the Galaxy Disco, and then they all went back to the Burger Chef. Eventually, the friends would leave the Burger Chef. Mark would get back to work, and India would catch a ride home with Daniel Davis, her co-worker. Daniel Roy Danny Davis was 16 years old and born on September 6th of 1962. It was said that he didn't have many friends and that he was somewhat of a loner. Danny in the afternoon would typically take a computer course at the high school he went to. Well, that high school bused them to another school, but close enough. Dan would usually drive from school right to Burger Chef. It was said he was really into photography and even had a photo lab in his house. He loved reading books and modeling airplanes. Dan was also a member of the Civil Air Patrol, which according to Wikipedia is a congressionally chartered, federally supported, non-profit corporation that serves as the official civilian auxiliary of the United States Air Force. Dan wanted to join the Air Force as soon as he would graduate from high school, where he averaged to be. Now, I believe that Dan had been one of the people to tell on his coworkers to his manager for, I believe, smoking the good green in the back of the restaurant. This is most likely the person that Jane had fired about 2 weeks before. It says something about this in the FBI report, but most of the information is redacted. Also, Dan's mother wanted him to quit this job and find a new one closer to where they lived, but he insisted that he liked it there. On Friday, November 17th of 1978, Dan at about 9:45 p.m. called his family from work and asked if he could stay late or until midnight to help out his coworkers because they were down a person at work, and also that he needed the hours to earn money for Christmas presents. His parents told him that this was okay, and this was the last time that they would ever talk. Now, the last person inside of Burger Chef was the 17-year-old girl, Ruth Ellen Shelton, who was born on December 19th of 1960. Ruth was about 5'4" and 85 to 90 pounds. She was a small girl and a junior in high school. Ruth was on the honor rolls list and never even so much as had a boyfriend. She kinda had this little fling with a boy from her church youth camp, but it never really went anywhere. Ruth originally worked at the Dunkin' Donuts that was very close to the Burger Chef, but in July of 1978, she went to Burger Chef to begin working. It was said that Ruth was not involved in any and didn't have any mental issues, that she was usually calm during a tense situation, but would be quite upset about it afterwards. Apparently, a few years before 1978, Ruth was out shopping with her dad when she was caught shoplifting. This wasn't reported to the police, and a bit later, her parents found more stolen items in her room, but they made her return them all. After all of that, Ruth's grades picked up, and there was no more issues later. Ruth's parents also stated that Ruth never ran away from home, and that at some time she actually had a problem with Jane, the assistant manager. Apparently, Jane would make Ruth do all of the dirty work, and Ruth complained to Jane, I guess, and then this problem was fixed. On November 17th of 1978, Ruth's mother drove her to work at about 3:45 p.m. and planned to pick her up that night. So now you have a bit of an understanding of who was there that night. To recap, you had Jane, the assistant manager, Mark, the cook, who was said to kind of have a fling with Jane, Danny or Dan, the teenager who just wanted to get more money for Christmas, and Ruth, who was just very innocent. Now, let's dive into what possibly could have transpired this awful night. On that Friday, these 4 workers were closing up for the night. Earlier, I mentioned that they were short-staffed. Well, another worker, a guy who I'll call Paul, was supposed to work that night. He was scheduled from 10 a.m. to closing, or about 11 a.m., but they would all stay till about 12 to 2 a.m. And that night, or November 17th, Paul's car started to have trouble, and so he called Jane, the assistant manager, and told her that his battery was dead. Paul made this call at around 9:35 p.m. At around 11:30 p.m., Paul called Jane again and told her his battery was fixed and asked her if he still needed to come into work. I'm guessing Jane told him to, because right after they got off of the phone, Paul left and he headed to Burger Chef. Though I am a bit confused here, because I believe Paul was the one who had gotten fired earlier in the week. I'll talk a little more about this shortly. Meanwhile, at the restaurant, these 4 employees were cleaning up, and there's a lot of mystery, theory, and speculation about what exactly happened. But what we do know is that it was most likely Dan's job to take the dumpster out, and so I believe that's what he did. Typically, when the employees would do this, they would also leave the door cracked open. Well, after taking the trash out, Dan would go back inside, and very shortly, I'm talking within minutes, all 4 of these employees disappeared. Now, a different employee, whose name was Brian, went out together with Ginger, the employee that Mark took the shift from on that Friday, and he brought her home at about 12 p.m. The two of them drove past the Burger Chef, and this was at about 11:45 p.m. When they went by, they noticed Jane's car was not there and the lights weren't on. Right after this, Brian then went to the Burger Chef to see if he could help them finish cleaning up. The reason being was because one of the people that worked that night actually helped him clean up one time, and so Brian wanted to repay the favor. Eventually, he would make his way to the restaurant and start going to the back door. Immediately, he noticed that the door was cracked open. Brian at this point was already kind of suspicious because it was normally closed. So he then went inside, and immediately he could tell that something was very wrong. Brian found the cash register drawers on the floor with no money in them, besides coins, and the restaurant's safes were open as well. About 2 to 5 minutes later, the other Burger Chef employee, Paul, pulled up in his father's van type of truck. Brian told Paul that there was some sort of robbery, that the door was open and nobody was inside. Brian said that the normal cleaning procedure was started, but the floors were dirty still, and the broiler was on too. Brian said there was change all over the place and the safe was open. He said there was 2 purses, both Jane's and Ruth's, and there was no sign of a struggle. Paul said that he wants nothing to do with this, and so he left the scene. Brian then called their other manager, probably the general manager, and told them what he found, and they told him to call the police. Within about 15 minutes, the police were there, and immediately they did not take this entire thing seriously. Brian told the police that he felt it was unusual for Paul to show up at the restaurant because he was scheduled to work from 10 p.m. to close, but he didn't show up. Also, Brian felt like Paul wouldn't have wanted the assistant manager, Jane, to see him. For some reason, the police had thought that the employees had basically stolen the money, which was $581 total dollars or so, and went out to have a night of fun or something like that, which obviously makes 0 sense. Not only did the police say that, but they told the employees for the morning shift to clean up the restaurant as normal. Yes, they told employees to clean up a crime scene. Very strange, as I don't think that has ever been a normal procedure, but the employees did just that. And get this right, the police actually went back and staged a crime scene there to take pictures for the FBI because they got involved about a day later. The FBI took notice to these pictures and thought they seemed weird from the beginning. On Saturday, November 18th of 1978, the police really began their investigation and called all of the parents of the missing people and started to talk to witnesses that were in the area. First, we'll start with a girl who was friends with India Flemons, Mark's sister. At about 9 to 9:30 p.m., these 2 girls were inside the Burger Chef when 2 poorly dressed white males came into the restaurant. They were only there for about 30 seconds, looking around before they decided to leave. This girl only noticed these men because they were dirty and dressed like it. The next witness was a guy who was friends with Mark Flemons. He was actually there at the restaurant with India and her friend at the time, but he said he didn't see the guys. I also don't know his name, and it's not super relevant, but basically this guy and Mark planned to meet up at 11:30 to 11:45 p.m. to walk home together on that Friday. This guy was having fun at the Galaxy Disco for teenagers, and at about 11:55 p.m., he left the disco and he started to walk towards the Burger Chef. He noticed that the lights were on, and he saw 2 males standing in the counter area, and he said that they were around the same height, but they weren't dressed in Burger Chef outfits like the employees typically would be. When this friend of Mark's saw the light on, he felt relieved because he wanted to walk home with Mark, and so he started to jog over to the restaurant. By this time, the friend had gotten to the restaurant, and it couldn't have been just a minute or so. He looked inside and saw no one. The friend then went to the back side of the restaurant and noticed the door was completely open. The friend began calling out for Mark several times, but no one responded. This friend said that the parking lot was empty except for Jane Freet's car and a Ford Pinto station wagon, which was Dan's car. Now, Jane's car being there at that moment is interesting, and we'll dive deep into that here shortly. There were 3 other witnesses, a mother, her daughter, and the daughter's friend. The mother was picking her daughter up from Dunkin' Donuts after the daughter and her friend were at a roller skating party. The mother got to Dunkin' Donuts and went inside to get some donuts, and she saw a 4-door station wagon pull into the Dunkin' Donuts parking lot and face the Burger Chef restaurant. Inside were 2 white guys who appeared to be off-putting. The mother said that the car was also old and junky, and after being inside of Dunkin' for about 5 minutes, the mother went back to her car. The daughter and her friend saw these 2 men, and these guys were trying to get their attention. 2 more witnesses, the last ones, were a boyfriend and girlfriend, and I believe the girlfriend worked at a different business next to Dunkin' Donuts, which was located right by Burger Chef. But at about 11 p.m. or so, the girlfriend got off of work, and the boyfriend was there waiting for her. The 2 of them then went behind Dunkin' Donuts so that way the girlfriend could smoke a cigarette, but she realized she didn't have any matches. She asked her boyfriend to go to Burger Chef to get some matches, and so he did. He got them from Ruth Shelton. The boyfriend then went back to his girlfriend, and they went behind the Burger Chef building by the railroad tracks, so that way the girlfriend could smoke. While sitting down, all of a sudden 2 guys approached them. Both parties of the couple have zero idea where the men came from. They just kind of appeared. Both of these men were white and dirty looking in a way. They were very sketchy and didn't seem right. One of the men asked the couple if they had ID, and the boyfriend responded and said no. The man then told the couple that they better get out of there because there's been a lot of vandalism in the area. The couple then got up and walked away, and when they looked back, the 2 men were on the railroad tracks still. Now, all of these witnesses gave a very similar description to what these men looked like, and here is the drawn composite sketches. A very interesting thing to note here is that the girlfriend that we just talked about said that the police officer that interviewed her that night kind of resembled one of the guys she saw. This is interesting because of what comes in a bit. At about 4 a.m. on Saturday, November 18th, police found Jane's white 1974 Chevy Vega abandoned next to a park, not too far away from the restaurant and only a block away from the police and fire department. The passenger side door was unlocked and not all the way closed, and the driver's side door was locked. If you remember correctly, an interesting thing about Jane's car was that the friend of Mark's who called out for him had seen Jane's car in the parking lot still at about 11:45 p.m. So it makes you wonder what exactly happened, or where were they in that short period of time? A few people who lived where this occurred said some things about this situation. One neighbor claimed she heard a loud noise while watching a movie from 11:30 to 12:30, but she didn't really care about it. Another neighbor said she heard a car door slam, and when she looked out her window, she saw the white Vega parked in front of her house, but she thought it was her neighbor's. She said this happened at around 12:30 to 1:30 a.m. The last neighbor said that he was out visiting his girlfriend when he got home at 1 a.m. He parked directly in front of the white Vega, and there was only one other car on the street during that time. That was his neighbor's. This guy said that at about 1:30 a.m. that he heard a loud noise outside that sounded like a trash can was being knocked over or a car door was being closed. On Sunday, November 19th of 1978, a couple was walking on their property in the White River Township when they discovered all four bodies of these innocent workers. They were all dead, and not all of them were killed in the same way. Both Dan and Ruth were found lying face down and were both shot multiple times with a .38 caliber gun. Jane's body had been found anywhere from 30 to 75 yards to the south of where Dan and Ruth were found, and Jane had been stabbed twice in the heart, and the knife's blade actually broke off into her chest. Mark had been found around 75 to 80 yards to the west of both Dan and Ruth, and it's unclear exactly how he died. There's speculation that he was hit with a chain or something, and that caused blunt force trauma, and then he may have tried running away and ran into a tree. The police were absolutely baffled. They had no idea what they were dealing with. And I'm now going to go over what exactly happened afterwards and the theories surrounding this case. Well, first off, a reward was put out for anyone that knew anything about what happened to these employees, and that was for $25,000. On November 20th of 1978, Ruth Shelton's father began to receive a ton of harassing phone calls. The next day, on November 21st, he received 2 more phone calls harassing him about Ruth at about 3 a.m. and then at around 8 a.m. This same day, a phone call was made anonymously through a payphone to the police and their tips hotline for this case. The caller stated that a guy with the initials PH was involved in this murder. The next day, on November 22nd, Ruth's funeral was held, so were Jane's and Danny's. This day, Ruth's father received an anonymous sympathy card, and someone who he didn't know rang his doorbell at 8:16 p.m. Mark's funeral came a few days later, on November 24th of 1978, and this same day, the police released clay busts of what the 2 men who were seen behind Burger Chef may have looked like. A couple of days would go by, and on November 29th of 1978, a huge clue appeared when a letter came in to the Indianapolis Star. This letter goes as follows: if you can talk the DA department into giving complete immunity, there are 3 persons involved in which was to be nothing more than a simple robbery. But 1 person did the shooting and 1 did the stabbing, and the 3rd person sit in the car and was very surprised. I am not the 3rd person, but I do know this person would give up and confess if you promise immunity. The 3rd person does not want your reward money, just immunity, but I would like to have it. I can tell you this, the 2 people that did the damage is no longer in Indiana. On December 3rd of 1978, a guy was held in jail because police believed him to be a suspect in the case, but he was cleared quickly. 2 days later, on December 5th of 1978, the Indianapolis Star received another letter from the same guy, and it went as follows: I don't think I will be able to help anymore. The 3rd person is now scared that even if you would give complete immunity, that they, the killers, would have someone kill the 3rd person sooner or later. But you got to believe that the 3rd person didn't know what was going to happen to the 4 kids. When they all arrive in the woods, they was just going to tie them up and leave. Supposedly there was nothing about killing them. The 3rd person tried to stop them, and supposedly while after the first child was shot, the 3rd person yelled run and got beat up for it. I wish the one that ran into the tree didn't died. That way maybe you policemen would have had these killers locked up by now. The 3 are not together and haven't been since that morning. I will not turn in the 3rd person because I believe the story I heard was the truth. I got my fingers crossed that maybe the inmate at Sin, Ohio might just know one of the killers, and that maybe you'll clean this mess up yourselves without getting the 3rd person involved. But I have got a plan that if everything else fail, we might do. If you would put in the newspapers that there might be a 3rd person willing to talk, then the 2 men might just come into town to kill the 3rd person. I would be close in hand just in case. I have a gun, and I would use it on them. I'm sorry that I can't help any more than thus but break a promise." 15 days later, on December 20th of 1978, the Indiana Attorney General at the time, a guy named Theodore Sendak, was sent a letter by most likely the same guy who sent letters to the Indianapolis Star. This letter has a lot of redacted names, but reveals quite the amount. "Mr. Sendak, Your Honor, here is the names of the murderers in the Burger Chef at Speedway. These are the murderers." This guy continues by saying one man transported bodies and that he doesn't have the name of someone. Also that the motive was jealousy. This man said something about getting sweet with Freet, so they had to have somehow kind of known Jane or something. Just a quick tidbit here, Jane also was known as Sweet Jane. But this guy said that the kids were murdered in a rental house. Also that the FBI and police department are involved in a cover-up. That someone whose name is redacted as an investigator in the strike force under a different name, and that she used a bunch of different names. That this woman set up the robbery and misguided everybody. This is what I was referring to earlier with the witness or the girlfriend who was behind the Burger Chef. She said that one of the guys kind of resembled a police officer. But this man continued this letter by saying that the sketch in the paper of those people resembles someone, and later down the line said he'll bring more information to Mr. Sendak's office. I believe this man then went to his office and they talked, and this guy actually drew a map, and that depicted the location of where the bodies were found. This map was very accurate in the detailing, and they even asked him if he visited the crime scene afterwards, but he had never been there before and actually learned about everything through the people responsible and their associates. After this happened, for some reason, the case of the Burger Chef murders would go cold. There's also some more things that happened in 1979 that I'll talk about later. But on November 18th of 1980, a letter was sent to the regional director of the FBI. It was received on November 21st and reads as follows. I don't think that this is the same guy as before. I think that they might be different, but I could be wrong. Gentlemen, this note is again anonymous. I have a bad case of amnesia. The last 2 days have been pure hell. I am the individual who survived the night of the Burger Chef mass murders. I intend to come forward in June of 1981. The reason is that I must do some things before then. The act as a witness will ruin my life. I did not pull the trigger that killed Jane. Russian roulette against my head was the killer's first pleasure. They also had me redacted. I believe I may be able to identify them. I believe they are the ones held in Minnesota. Maybe though, if they were professional hitmen, they wore disguises like those two in Minnesota. Now I was a mere customer. I tried to get away, but they forced me with all of the other 4. Jane was kept away from us. It was democratic that we not try to gang up on one. They had several pistols and very long knives. It was therefore democratic that we all run for it. The girl was shot first as soon as the dash took place. I was going to stay behind to face them. One knocked me into the ground and went after Mark, and the other chased Dan. We had thought Jane already dead. Later, I was bound. Then Jane was there bound. She said, along with me, we did not want to die. 3 clicks against my head. I did not die. They unbound me and put a gun in my hand. Meanwhile, they both held me, one with his hands on my hand and that gun, and the other with a long knife at my throat. They found out I did not want to pull the trigger and kill Jane. I did not. The one's hands on my hand pressures me so against the fingers that the gun went off and Jane lie dead. It was dark, very dark. I thought I was dead. This was when I was forced, I believe, to beg for my life. The one who killed by hand, Mark, suggested to the other that they let me go since I was now somewhat involved, so I would be a decoy. They gave me Jane's car. I do not know why I am not dead. I feel dead. I was just a mere customer. I cannot kill. I am not like they are. I want no publish of this until June. I want you to keep it secret from the press until that time. Please furnish copies to the IDP and SWP. I want immunity. I am not guilty of any crime. I was only a customer. I should be dead. I'm sorry that I lived. I also want to start a new life somewhere else. Further down on this note, it states that the guys who murdered Jane and the rest of the employees were paid to kill Jane. I don't think anything ever came from this note, as he did say that Jane died in a different way than how she actually died, and a lot of it seemed a bit off. I don't know who wrote these notes either. In 1981, quite a lot of things would happen. First, beginning in late January, an investigation was started into a large cocaine dealing ring. 3 people on March 5th of 1981 were arrested, and one of those people was James Freet. James was the brother of Jane Freet, the assistant manager. An undercover agent busted these 3 guys for all selling over 30 grams of cocaine. The guy's group name was The Company. Now, about a week later, James was being looked at as a person of interest in the murders of the Burger Chef employees, including his sister. It stated that the investigators had a direct link between the murders and narcotic dealers. I think that was James and his sister's relationship. About 6 days after they started looking into James for the Burger Chef murders, they ruled him out as a suspect. Now, what's really interesting here is something that's stated and I don't believe brought back up again. The police, when they reported about James now being looked at as a suspect, said that they were informed that Mark Flemons, the Burger Chef cook, was in fear for his life a day before all of that happened. Apparently, he owed a pusher $7,000 and told a friend of his that he was afraid he would be killed if he didn't pay the money back. Very interesting, but once again, I don't think anything came from this, a common theme here. Though James was given a 6-year sentence, all of it was suspended besides 40 days, and he already served those days, so basically he was a free man. But a few months later, on May 27th of 1981, I believe the same guy who sent the notes from earlier went to the Indianapolis office of the FBI to talk about what he knew. These conversations were taped, and I don't think they were ever released. Another very interesting thing would happen the next year in May of 1982. On Thursday, May 20th, 4 men were arrested for the Christmas Eve murder of a drug dealer. One of those men was named Kevin M. Flemons. This was Mark's older brother. Kevin pled guilty to conspiracy to commit murder, conspiracy to commit robbery, and robbery. He was sentenced to 25 years on each count, and the sentences are to run concurrently. I brought this up because of what we just talked about involving Mark. I don't know if Mark and Kevin hung out and Mark was involved in everything Kevin was doing. I really just don't know, as a lot of the people involved in this are now deceased. Also in 1982, a woman, I'm unsure of who, went to talk to the police with some knowledge about the murders. Now, a few years would go by with no real leads until November of 1984 came, and the biggest clue or evidence would come out. A guy named Donald Wayne Forrester called the Speedway investigators from the Pendleton Correctional Facility and told them he knows about what happened at the Burger Chef. This man was 34 years old in 1984, and let me give you a brief little history of Donald. I couldn't find a crazy amount of information on him, but this should give you enough to get an understanding of how horrible he was. Donald, at the age of 28, was a divorced father of 2, he had 7 sisters, and he was also a 3-time sex offender. He was first charged in California with, and then the charges were dismissed when the victim refused to testify. Donald was also convicted of assault and battery with intent to commit sodomy against a family member. He served a total of 6 years and 10 months in jail and was released in October of 1978, only a month before the Burger Chef murders. The next year, on March 31st of 1979, while Donald was on probation, he was out with a friend or cousin of his named Dale. This year, Donald was 28, and while he was out with Dale, they went to a disco. By the time the early morning rolled around on April 1st, these 2 men were harassing the waitresses and guests, and so the manager told them to leave. After Donald and Dale left, they drove to an all-night diner just across the parking lot. They went inside, had some food, and took notice to a woman who was by herself. They never talked to her though. When this woman left, Donald and Dale followed her and then started to trail her in her car. This woman became a bit suspicious and then pulled to the side of the road. Donald walked up to her and put a gun to her head and forced her out of her car into their car. While inside of the car, Donald and Dale took advantage of this woman, especially Donald. A bit after that, Dale was the one driving and Donald was in the passenger seat. Donald began to look through his clothes to find his gun and told Dale to take her to the country because Donald was going to kill her. This woman very bravely, while Dale was driving at about 20 to 40 miles per hour in a neighborhood, jumped out of the car and ran to the first home she saw and called the police. After a week and 1 day, the police, who said they were working 18 hours a day on this case, finally caught up to Donald and Dale, and they were both arrested and charged with a lot of things, specifically. Eventually, Dale ratted out Donald, and Dale was given a 6-year sentence at a youth center because he was 19. Donald claimed that Dale knew nothing and that he had a 6th grade reading level and was an idiot. Donald was sentenced to 95 years in prison, and the jury took about 40 minutes to convict him. So now you understand who Donald is. Well, between June of 1985 to about November of 1986, Donald was in contact with the police and confessing all about the Burger Chef murders. This all happened after an inmate who knew Donald since they were kids basically outed him in November of 1984 and gave the police a huge confession. At first, the police thought Donald may have been lying, but then they realized that he was most likely telling the truth. Donald began to describe in very vivid detail on how each person died and what exactly happened. He basically stated that on the night of November 17th of 1978, James Freet, Jane's brother, had owed money to some bad people, and so a few dealers went to the Burger Chef to, for some reason, harass Jane, even though it was her brother who was the problem. But while this was happening, Mark Flemons, the 16-year-old cook, had walked up to the guys and basically told them to stop messing with Jane. This started a fight between them, and Mark fell and he hit his head and lost consciousness. Afterwards, the people responsible thought that Mark died, and so they decided quickly that they needed to get rid of any witnesses. Next, these men got all of the employees together and got them to go to Jane's car. I guess they must have put Mark into the trunk or something. Then they drove to the park area, and I read that they got into their getaway car and left Jane's Chevy Vega there. Now, I'm curious if someone was trailing behind them in the getaway car, because if not, the car being parked where it was would most likely mean that this crime wasn't just random, but deliberate. But afterwards, the men drove the workers to a field, and Donald said he was the one who shot Danny and Ruth, and that he also helped to kill Jane. I read that Mark may have been beaten with a chain, but that he ran into a tree and died afterwards. Now, Donald at first claimed this was all related to drugs, and which that part I'm a bit confused about. Donald also at first claimed he didn't kill anyone and asked for full immunity and a few other things, claiming he knew where one of the murder weapons, a pair of bloody boots, and a coat inside of a bag were. It was at a house on Patricia Street in Indianapolis, Indiana. When the investigators went there, they found nothing. Though the police also drove Donald to the murder location, and he was able to tell them exactly where every person was killed. Donald told police that the murder weapon, a .38 caliber pistol, was thrown into the White River, which was close to a bridge downtown. Police went there and tried to find it, but did not. And to be fair, it had been about 8 years since Donald had apparently thrown it in there. But between June of 1985 to November of 1986, the police were in communication with Donald about a lot of things. Before they started talking to Donald, though, a detective originally on the case in 1979 had talked to some reporters and said some crucial information. This detective said that Donald Forrester's ex-wife made a statement in 1979, a year after the murders, that she had actually been with Donald when he took her to the scene of the murders about 2 weeks after it happened. This ex-wife said Donald searched for shell casings along the stream by where the workers were found, and that Donald found 6 casings. One was large, and the rest of them were small. Donald then drove the 2 of them back home, he flushed the casings down the toilet, and then made a phone call to someone. Chiming back in again, how on earth were the police not able to find those 6 casings? How did Donald go there 2 weeks later and pick them up? Not only this, but also in 1979, it was the year Donald was convicted in his case. The police filed some reports that stated they believed Donald had knowledge about the Burger Chef murders, and they made that statement after they had an interview with him after he got arrested for his heinous crime. Donald told them he wasn't going to talk about Burger Chef in 1979 because he felt like he had been prejudiced with the witness in his other case and that he was innocent. But when police heard the story from Donald's wife about the casings, the police went and got a search warrant to search the septic tank, and they found the .38 caliber shell casings. So basically, there's 2 huge pieces of evidence right there. I mean, the fact that Donald's ex-wife said that he did it and went and got the shell casings, and even said she went with him, and the fact that the police went themselves and got them out of the septic tank. Donald wrote the police an apparent 1,200-page statement. I don't know if that's a typo or not. Maybe they meant to say 1,200 words, because 1,200 pages is incredibly long. He implicated multiple other people in the story, I believe 3 others. Donald, by the end of November of 1986, was set to be charged with the crimes of murder. But on either November 17th or 18th, Donald recanted everything he said and claimed that he was coerced into saying he did it because he wanted to get a better sentence and also to buy some time. Donald would later state that he didn't want to be seen as a snitch or get harmed in prison for helping the police, and that he was also mad that some of the police officers leaked stuff to the newspapers. Donald recanting his statement would basically make any charges invalid, and the DA decided he didn't want to try and charge Donald because of a supposed lack of evidence. Even though they had the shell casings, Donald's confession, his wife's confession, and a bunch of other evidence too. This would essentially make the case go cold, even though they also had the names of everyone else involved. Even to this day, the police are stating that anyone who has any information to let them know. But I think that they're the ones who have all the information really needed. Years later, in 1999, Donald restated in a videotaped confession that he was a part of the Burger Chef murders. The sheriff at the time said he expected no action on the confession, which I don't understand why. About 7 years after this, Donald Ray Forrester would die in prison on June 27th of 2006 at the age of 56 due to cancer. This case has been cold since 1978. At the time of this recording, it's been just about 46 years. All of these innocent people would be in their 60s right now, enjoying the later half of life, but they were never afforded that opportunity. It's very upsetting as none of the parents of the victims are alive anymore, and time just keeps passing. There is a lot about this case I'm confused on, and I'm sure you are too. That involved whether or not Jane's brother was involved. What exactly was going on with Mark's supposed debt to a dealer, and how exactly did Mark die? Also, the police in November of 2018 released an image of the knife that was used in the attacks in hopes that someone could identify who it belonged to. I don't understand why they would do that if Donald supposedly had given them every name of the people that were there. It's hard to believe that Donald would have lied about what he knew, as his ex-wife implicated him. Plus, the police literally went and got the shell casings. I just don't understand why they botched this case up so badly. They talked to Donald in 1979 and his ex-wife, and they suspected Donald of being a part of it. Another question that I'm a bit confused about is earlier, I stated that Mark's friend came into the parking lot and saw Jane's car and Danny's car, but no one was inside. What exactly happened within that couple of minutes? Were they being held hostage inside somewhere? But whatever, it's a pretty small detail. There's just a lot of things I don't understand about this case, such as why were both Danny and Ruth killed by being shot? And why was Jane killed by being stabbed? It's very personal compared to being shot. Me personally, I'm going to boil this down to the police messing it up from the very beginning with the crime scene. They cleaned up any footprints, fingerprints, or DNA evidence they could have extracted. They screwed things up royally, and even attempted to fake as if they didn't. Just so upsetting. My last thing I want to touch on here is, who sent the original notes? Was that also Donald? Because it was said that the map that was drawn was very accurate in detail. So I'm curious who sent all of those original notes. I couldn't find an exact statement saying who it was. I pray that one day this case can be solved, or if the perpetrators are still alive, they can be arrested. I genuinely hope that Jane, Mark, Danny, and Ruth are all resting peacefully. None of them deserved this awful fate that they were given. But anyways, thank you for watching this episode of High Time Crime. If true crime is your thing, then please like and subscribe because it's all we do. I also have an all-exclusive Patreon if you're interested in that. There's a bunch of tiers to choose from, and the third one allows for you to see a Patreon-only video, and that tier and the second one allow you to have your name at the end of each High Time Crime video. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care, friend.